Jasmine clutched the thin, cream-colored envelope in her trembling hands, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sounds of her family bustling in the kitchen. The return address read, Princeton University Admissions Office. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of for years. She closed her eyes for a brief second, her mind flashing back to the countless nights she spent hunched over her textbooks, her lamp flickering as she scribbled down notes. The part-time shifts at the diner after school, the debates with her debate team, the tutoring sessions with younger students. It had all led to this. Jasmine, open it already, her younger brother called from the living room, but Jasmine couldn't move yet. The fear of disappointment gripped her. What if it wasn't enough? What if her sacrifices hadn't paid off? Taking a deep breath, she slid her finger under the seal and carefully unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the words, and then she froze. Congratulations. Her breath caught. We are pleased to offer you admission to Princeton University with a full scholarship to our class of 2027. A shriek escaped her lips as tears streamed down her face. I got in! I got in! She cried, running into the kitchen where her mom stood. Her family erupted into cheers, her mom pulling her into a tight embrace. You deserve this, sweetheart, her mom whispered, her voice trembling with pride. Jasmine felt the weight of all their sacrifices in that moment. Her mother had worked long hours cleaning houses to support the family. This victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to all of them. But not everyone shared her joy. The next day at school, Jasmine walked into her AP Literature class with a spring in her step. She had barely slept, too excited about the future. When Mrs. Simmons entered the room, Jasmine couldn't resist sharing her news. I got into Princeton, she said, her voice bright. Mrs. Simmons paused, her lips curling into a tight smile. Oh, that's nice, she replied, her tone flat. Then, after a beat, she added, You know, Ivy League schools are incredibly demanding. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure? The words stung, but Jasmine brushed them off. Maybe Mrs. Simmons didn't mean anything by it. Maybe she was just being realistic. Still, as the weeks passed, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Simmons's words weren't just innocent comments. They felt pointed, sharp, as if meant to chip away at her confidence. And Jasmine was about to find out just how far her teacher would go to undermine her dreams. Let me know how this feels for the opening. If you're happy with it, I'll move on to the rising tension section. Your feedback is always welcome. At first, Jasmine tried to ignore it. The occasional sharp remarks from Mrs. Simmons, the subtle digs cloaked in faux concern, seemed too petty to dwell on. Maybe Mrs. Simmons was like this with everyone, Jasmine reasoned. But as the weeks went by, the small comments began to snowball into something much bigger. Your essay lacks depth, Jasmine, Mrs. Simmons said one afternoon as she handed back a paper marked with an uncharacteristic C-. Jasmine stared at the red ink, her chest tightening. She had spent hours crafting that essay, carefully analyzing the assigned novel and referencing the resources Mrs. Simmons had recommended. What specifically was wrong with it? Jasmine asked, her voice steady but her hands clammy. Mrs. Simmons sighed, barely glancing at her. It's just not Ivy League material. You should try harder next time. Try harder? Jasmine felt her cheeks flush but swallowed her frustration. She decided to stay after class that day, hoping for constructive feedback. But when she approached Mrs. Simmons at her desk, the teacher barely looked up from her papers. I don't have time for this, Jasmine, Mrs. Simmons said curtly. If you're struggling, maybe you should consider dropping this class. It's advanced placement after all. Not everyone can handle it. The words hit Jasmine like a slap in the face. She wanted to argue, to point out that she had excelled in every AP class she'd taken before this, but something in Mrs. Simmons's tone warned her not to push. The weeks dragged on, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Whenever Jasmine submitted an assignment, it came back with inexplicably low grades. When she raised her hand in class, Mrs. Simmons either ignored her or brushed her off with a dismissive comment. One day, during a group discussion on The Great Gatsby, Jasmine offered an analysis of the green light, how it symbolized unattainable dreams and the enduring hope that drives people forward. That's interesting, Mrs. Simmons said, her tone dripping with condescension. But I think you're overcomplicating it. Maybe you should stick with the basics for now." Jasmine's classmates exchanged glances, some of them looking just as puzzled as she felt. Jasmine had always been a strong student. Her insights were usually met with praise or encouragement, but now it seemed as though nothing she did was good enough. The breaking point came in late spring, just as Jasmine was beginning to prepare for the senior awards ceremony. She had been nominated for the Excellence in Literature Award, a prestigious honor that had always gone to one of Mrs. Simmons's students. Jasmine knew her grades and participation made her a strong contender, or so she thought. "Jasmine, can I see you for a moment?" the school counselor, Mr. Carter, asked one afternoon as she walked past his office. Jasmine stepped inside, her stomach churning. Mr. Carter's expression was serious, his usually warm demeanor replaced with something guarded. "We need to talk about your transcript," he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. Jasmine frowned as she opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the page, and her heart sank. Several of her grades had been changed, marked lower than what she had earned. Her A in AP Literature was now a C. Her B+ in another class had been reduced to a D. "This doesn't make sense," Jasmine said, her voice shaking. "I know my grades. I have the graded papers to prove it." Mr. Carter leaned forward, his expression softening. "I believe you, Jasmine, but the selection committee for the Excellence in Literature Award flagged your transcript during their review. They're concerned about the discrepancies, and I wanted to bring this to your attention before it went any further." Jasmine's hands trembled as she clutched the folder. Someone had tampered with her records, someone with access to the school's grading system, and she had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who it was. That evening, Jasmine sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of graded assignments and emails she had printed out over the course of the semester. She combed through each one, highlighting inconsistencies and discrepancies. Her mom knocked softly on the door, peeking her head inside. "You've been quiet all night, sweetheart. Everything okay?" Jasmine hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "No, Mom, it's not okay." She explained what had happened, her voice breaking as she recounted the months of unfair treatment and the altered grades. Her mom's face hardened. "We're not going to let this slide," she said firmly. "You've worked too hard for this, Jasmine. If they think they can take this from you, they've got another thing coming." Jasmine nodded, her determination hardening. She wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of her dreams, not even a teacher. The next day, armed with her evidence, Jasmine scheduled a meeting with the principal, Dr. Reynolds. She sat in the office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she presented her case. "These are the grades I received on my assignments," Jasmine explained, sliding the stack of papers across the desk. "And this is what's listed on my transcript. They don't match." Dr. Reynolds frowned as she reviewed the documents. "This is serious," she said, her tone grave. "If what you're saying is true, then someone has violated school policy, and possibly the law." Jasmine swallowed hard. "I think it was Mrs. Simmons," she said quietly. "She's been targeting me all semester. I didn't want to believe it at first, but now—" Dr. Reynolds nodded, her expression unreadable. "We'll launch an internal investigation immediately. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Jasmine." As Jasmine left the office, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had done the right thing, but she couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough. What if they didn't believe her? What if Mrs. Simmons managed to cover her tracks? For the first time, Jasmine felt the weight of the odds stacked against her. But she also felt something else. A spark of defiance, a refusal to let anyone take her dreams away. The next week passed in a blur. Jasmine barely slept, her nerves frayed as she anxiously awaited the results of the investigation. Every time she walked past Mrs. Simmons in the hallway, her stomach churned. The teacher's demeanor hadn't changed, still cold, still dismissive, but Jasmine could sense a flicker of unease in the way Mrs. Simmons avoided holding her gaze. Dr. Reynolds had assured Jasmine that the investigation would be thorough, involving a review of the school's grading system and interviews with staff. But the waiting was excruciating. Jasmine spent every spare moment poring over her evidence, replaying her interactions with Mrs. Simmons in her mind, searching for anything she might have missed. Then, one afternoon, she was called to the principal's office. Jasmine's palms were slick with sweat as she sat across from Dr. Reynolds, who wore a serious expression. On the desk between them was a thick folder. Evidence, Jasmine guessed, gathered over the past week. Jasmine, Dr. Reynolds began, her tone careful. Thank you for your patience during this process. I want to start by saying that we take your allegations very seriously, and after a thorough review, we've uncovered some troubling information. Jasmine's breath caught. She gripped the arms of her chair, bracing herself. Our IT department reviewed the access logs for the grading system, Dr. Reynolds continued. It appears that someone with administrative privileges altered your grades on multiple occasions. The changes were traced back to Mrs. Simmons' account. Jasmine's heart pounded. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like both a relief and a blow. Additionally, Dr. Reynolds said, several of your classmates provided statements supporting your claims of unfair treatment in the classroom. They noted instances where Mrs. Simmons dismissed your contributions or criticized your work more harshly than others. One student even overheard her making a comment about how affirmative action gives some students false hope. Jasmine's stomach twisted at the words. She clenched her fists, the anger bubbling up inside her. Reynolds leaned forward, her expression softening. I can't begin to imagine how difficult this has been for you, Jasmine. What Mrs. Simmons did was not only unethical, but deeply harmful. We've placed her on administrative leave pending further disciplinary action, and will be reporting this incident to the school board. Jasmine nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to feel triumphant, but all she could think about was the months of self-doubt and frustration she had endured. There's one more thing, Dr. Reynolds added. We've contacted Princeton University to inform them of the situation. They've assured us that this will have no impact on your scholarship or admission. A wave of relief washed over Jasmine, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. She had fought back, and she had won. The news spread quickly through the school. By the next morning, everyone was talking about Mrs. Simmons. Whispers followed Jasmine wherever she went, and while some students offered words of support, others seemed hesitant to approach her. Hey, Jasmine, a girl from her chemistry class said as they stood by their lockers. I just wanted to say, you're really brave. What she did to you was so messed up. Thanks, Jasmine said, offering a small smile. But not everyone was on her side. She probably exaggerated the whole thing. One boy muttered to his friend as Jasmine walked past. Teachers don't just change grades for no reason. Jasmine ignored the comment, but it stung. No matter how much evidence there was, some people would always doubt her. That evening, a local journalist called her house, asking for an interview. Jasmine hesitated, unsure if she wanted to share her story with the world, but her mom encouraged her to speak up. This isn't just about you, Jasmine, her mom said gently. There are other kids out there who've faced the same thing and didn't have the chance to fight back. You can be a voice for them. Jasmine agreed, and the next day, she sat down with the journalist in a quiet corner of the school library. She spoke about her journey, her dreams, her struggles, and the betrayal she had faced. I just want people to understand how hard it is to succeed when the people who are supposed to lift you up are the ones holding you down, Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. But I also want them to know that it's possible to rise above it. You don't have to let anyone define your worth. The interview went viral, sparking a wave of support from the community. Parents, students, and alumni flooded the school with emails and calls, demanding accountability. The story even reached national news outlets, igniting conversations about racism and bias in education. For Jasmine, the attention was overwhelming. She appreciated the support, but she also felt exposed, her private struggles laid bare for the world to see. Still, she reminded herself of her mom's words. This wasn't just about her. It was about every student who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Mrs. Simmons resigned before the school board could take further action. Jasmine heard through the grapevine that the teacher had claimed she was misunderstood and that her actions had been taken out of context. But Jasmine didn't care anymore. For the first time in months, she felt free. On a warm September morning, Jasmine stood on the steps of Princeton's iconic Nassau Hall, a crisp breeze tugging at her curls. She took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. She had made it. As she walked through the campus, Her heart swelled with pride. Her journey hadn't been easy, but every obstacle had made her stronger. She thought about her mom, her brother, and all the people who had supported her along the way. And she thought about Mrs. Simmons. Jasmine didn't hate her, not anymore. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of pity. Mrs. Simmons had tried to steal Jasmine's future, but in the end, all she had done was expose her own insecurities. Jasmine smiled to herself as she stepped into her first lecture hall. She had proven that no amount of prejudice could hold her back. The media coverage of Jasmine's story didn't fade quickly. For weeks, her name was mentioned on news outlets, blogs, and social media platforms. While some saw her as a symbol of perseverance, others used her experience to shed light on the systemic challenges faced by students of color in education. Jasmine was invited to speak at a community forum organized by the local NAACP chapter. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, and the idea of standing in front of a crowd to recount her painful experience made her stomach churn. But her mom's unwavering encouragement and the flood of supportive messages she received from students across the country convinced her to do it. The night of the forum, Jasmine stood backstage, clutching the index cards she had prepared. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage to a round of applause. The bright lights made it hard to see the faces in the audience, but she could feel their energy. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "My name is Jasmine Carter, and I'd like to share a story with you. It's not just my story. It's the story of every student who's ever been told that their dreams are too big, that they don't belong, or that they're not good enough." She paused, scanning the room. "When I first learned that my grades had been changed, I felt like my entire future was slipping away. I questioned myself, my abilities, my worth, but then I realized something. No one has the right to take away your dreams. No one has the right to tell you who you can or can't be." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. "It would have been easy to give up," Jasmine continued, "to let the injustice define me. But I chose to fight, not just for myself, but for every student who's ever faced unfair treatment. And I want to tell you tonight that no matter how hard it gets, no matter how many people doubt you, you are stronger than you think. You have the power to rise above it." When she finished, the audience rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Jasmine's story inspired conversations at school board meetings, education conferences, and even on Capitol Hill. Her case became a catalyst for discussions about implicit bias, teacher accountability, and the need for systemic reform in schools. Jasmine was surprised when she began receiving letters from students across the country, some sharing their own struggles, others thanking her for speaking out. One letter in particular stood out. "Dear Jasmine," it began, "I just wanted to say thank you. I'm a junior in high school, and I've been dealing with a teacher who always seems to treat me differently because of who I am. I thought about giving up, but after hearing your story, I feel like I can keep going. You showed me that it's okay to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. Thank you for being so brave." Jasmine read the letter twice, tears welling in her eyes. She had never imagined that her experience could have such a profound impact on others. In the summer before her freshman year at Princeton, Jasmine was invited to attend a youth leadership summit in Washington, D.C. The event brought together students from diverse backgrounds to discuss issues like education equity and social justice. During one of the workshops, a fellow participant asked Jasmine how she had found the courage to stand up for herself. "I didn't feel brave at the time," Jasmine admitted, smiling slightly. "I was scared out of my mind, but I kept thinking about my little brother. I didn't want him to grow up in a world where people like Mrs. Simmons could get away with what she did. I wanted to set an example for him, and for every kid who's ever been told they don't belong." The other students nodded, their faces filled with admiration. Jasmine realized that, in her own way, she had become a leader, a role she hadn't sought but had embraced nonetheless. September arrived, and with it came the start of a new chapter in Jasmine's life. Her mom and brother helped her move into her dorm at Princeton, lugging boxes of clothes, books, and a few framed photos up the stairs. "You're going to do amazing things here," her mom said. her voice thick with emotion as they hugged goodbye. Jasmine smiled, blinking back tears. "I'll make you proud, Mom. I promise." As she walked across the campus that afternoon, taking in the ivy-covered buildings and the bustling energy of students hurrying to class, Jasmine felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had fought hard to be here, and now that she wasn't going to waste a single moment. Her first class was a seminar on American literature. As she settled into her seat, the professor, a kind-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, smiled warmly at the students. "Welcome to Princeton," she said. "This semester we're going to explore the power of storytelling, how the stories we tell shape not only our understanding of the world, but also our place in it." Jasmine felt a spark of excitement. She thought back to the countless nights she had spent with her nose in a book, losing herself in worlds far removed from her own. Stories had always been her refuge, her inspiration, and now, she realized, she had a story of her own to tell. The following spring, Jasmine returned to her high school as a guest speaker at the senior awards ceremony. It felt surreal to stand on the stage where, just a year earlier, she had wondered if her dreams would ever come true. "Your journey is just beginning," Jasmine told the graduating class. "There will be obstacles, and there will be people who doubt you. But don't let them define you. You are capable of more than you know. And when the world tries to tell you no, prove them wrong." As she spoke, Jasmine caught sight of her little brother in the audience, beaming up at her. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Years later, when Jasmine graduated from Princeton with honors, her story came full circle. She was offered a position at a nonprofit organization advocating for education reform, a chance to turn her pain into purpose. Jasmine knew her journey wasn't over, it was just beginning, but as she looked back on everything she had endured, she felt an unshakable confidence in her ability to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. Because if there was one thing Jasmine had learned, it was this: no matter how hard the road, no matter how many people try to stand in your way, you are stronger than you think, and your dreams are worth fighting for. This concludes Jasmine's story, bringing her journey full circle with a powerful resolution that highlights her resilience, growth, and the lasting impact of her actions. But Jasmine's story is not just fiction. It reflects the real struggles that many Black students face in education today. Did you know? According to a 2021 study by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, Black students are disproportionately disciplined in schools compared to their white peers, often receiving harsher punishments for the same infractions. A 2019 report from the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, found that only 8% of Black students were enrolled in highly selective colleges, largely due to systemic barriers, implicit bias, and lack of support in high schools. The Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology revealed that Black students are less likely to be recommended for gifted and advanced programs, unless their race is hidden during evaluations. What can we do about this? Jasmine fought back against injustice, and so can we. If you or someone you know has experienced discrimination in education, speak up. Your voice matters. Join the conversation. Have you ever faced a teacher who doubted your abilities or treated you unfairly? Tell your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone going through the same thing. Share this video to spread awareness, because no student should have their future stolen by bias and discrimination. Want to make a difference? Support organizations like the Education Trust and NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which fight for equal opportunities in education. Don't let anyone define your worth. You are stronger than you think, and your dreams are worth fighting for.